The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone marketplace of Aldermere as Thomas Whitmore arranged fresh loaves on his wooden cart. The smell of warm bread mixed with the crisp autumn air, drawing early customers to his modest stand. Thomas had been selling bread in this same spot for 15 years, ever since his father passed and left him the family bakery. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, stacking the golden loaves, while his mind wandered to the growing tensions in the kingdom. King Aldric's rule had grown increasingly harsh over the past months. New taxes were imposed weekly, and the royal guards enforced them with iron fists. The people of Aldermere whispered their complaints in dark corners, but none dared speak openly against the crown. Thomas had watched his neighbors struggle to pay the mounting fees, seeing families torn apart when fathers were dragged to debtors' prisons for owing a few silver coins. The marketplace buzzed with its usual morning activity when the sound of heavy boots echoed across the stones. A patrol of 6 royal guards marched into the square, their polished armor gleaming and ceremonial swords hanging at their sides. Captain Marcus Blackwood led them, a man known throughout the kingdom for his unwavering loyalty to the crown and his brutal enforcement of royal decrees. His cold gray eyes surveyed the merchants as if searching for prey. The guards moved systematically from stall to stall, collecting the new prosperity tax that King Aldric had announced just 3 days prior. Each merchant reluctantly handed over their coins, their faces showing resignation and barely concealed anger. Thomas watched as Mrs. Henderson, the elderly flower seller, counted out her last few coppers with trembling hands. Her grandson had been conscripted into the royal army the month before, and she struggled to feed herself on what little remained. When the guards reached Thomas's cart, Captain Blackwood stepped forward with an outstretched hand. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. The captain's presence seemed to darken the already tense atmosphere as other merchants paused their work to watch the exchange. The prosperity tax, Baker. 5 silver pieces as decreed by His Majesty, Blackwood announced, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Thomas felt his jaw tighten as he looked at the captain's expectant face. 5 silver pieces represented nearly half of what he earned in a good week. His wife Margaret was expecting their second child, and little Emma needed new shoes before winter arrived. The money in his pouch was already counted and allocated for necessities. Captain, with respect, I paid the harvest tax just last week, and before that the defense levy, Thomas said carefully, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. My family can barely afford the existing taxes. This new one will leave us with nothing for food and shelter. End quote. The other merchants in the square began to take notice of the exchange. Conversations died down as people turned to watch what was unfolding at the baker's cart. Captain Blackwood's expression hardened at Thomas's words, unused to having his authority questioned by a common tradesman. The king's decrees are not subject to debate, Baker. Pay the tax or face the consequences, Blackwood replied, his hand moving to rest on his sword hilt in a clear threat. Thomas glanced around at the faces watching him. He saw his own struggles reflected in their eyes. The same desperation and frustration that had been building for months. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The fear that had kept him compliant for so long began to transform into determination. I understand the consequences, Captain, Thomas said, straightening his shoulders. But I also understand that a man has a duty to provide for his family and to stand for what is right. I will not pay this tax. A collective gasp rippled through the marketplace. No one could remember the last time someone had openly defied the royal guard in such a public manner. Captain Blackwood's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at being challenged before so many witnesses. The tension in the air became almost suffocating as the captain stepped closer to Thomas, close enough that the baker could smell the leather of his armor and see the cold calculation in his eyes. The other guards moved to flank their captain, their hands also moving toward their weapons. You dare defy the crown? Blackwood hissed through clenched teeth. I could have you arrested for treason right here, right now. Thomas felt his heart pounding in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Then arrest me, Captain. But know that you'll be arresting a man who simply cannot squeeze blood from a stone. I have no money left to give. The crowd that had gathered around them grew larger as word spread quickly through the marketplace. People emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the unprecedented sight of someone standing up to the royal guard. Among them was Father Benedict from the local chapel, who had been counseling struggling families for weeks. There was also Master Henrik, the blacksmith, whose own shop had been struggling under the weight of the new taxes. Captain Blackwood found himself in an uncomfortable position. He was accustomed to swift compliance and had rarely faced such open defiance. The growing crowd made the situation more delicate, as any heavy-handed response would be witnessed by dozens of people who would undoubtedly spread word throughout the kingdom. "This is your final warning, Baker," the captain said, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "Pay the tax, or face imprisonment." Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him. He saw fear, but also something else beginning to emerge. Hope. For the first time in months, someone was saying what they all felt but had been too afraid to express. His decision in this moment would affect not just himself, but potentially everyone who was watching. "I cannot pay what I do not have," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the silent marketplace. "And I will not borrow money to enrich a king who already has more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, while his people starve." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before the entire kingdom. Captain Blackwood's face had turned an alarming shade of red, and his fellow guards shifted nervously as they sensed the crowd's mood beginning to change. What had started as a routine tax collection was rapidly becoming something much more significant. The captain's hand tightened on his sword, and for a moment it seemed he might draw it. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see whether blood would be spilled in their peaceful marketplace. Thomas stood his ground, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Captain Blackwood drew his sword halfway from its scabbard, the steel singing as it emerged. The sound cut through the morning air like a death knell, causing several people in the crowd to step back instinctively. But Thomas remained motionless, his eyes locked on the captain's face. The baker's stillness seemed to unnerve Blackwood more than any aggressive response might have. "You will regret this act of rebellion," the captain snarled, but something in his voice had changed. The absolute confidence was gone, replaced by an edge of uncertainty. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, and their silence was becoming oppressive. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation, waiting to see if the royal guard would actually shed blood over a handful of silver coins. Father Benedict stepped forward from the crowd, his brown robes rustling in the autumn breeze. The elderly priest had served the community for over 3 decades, and commanded respect from both commoners and nobles alike. His weathered face bore the wisdom of someone who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, and his presence changed the dynamic of the standoff immediately. "Captain Blackwood," the priest said in a voice that carried surprising authority for such a gentle man, "surely there is a way to resolve this matter without violence. Thomas Whitmore is a good man who has served this community faithfully for many years. His struggle is shared by many of our people." The captain's grip on his sword tightened, but he hesitated to fully draw it in front of the priest. Striking down a man of God, even indirectly, would have consequences that reached far beyond this marketplace. "Stay out of this, Father. This is a matter between the crown and a tax evader." Master Henrik, the burly blacksmith, moved to stand beside Father Benedict. His massive frame and soot-stained apron made him an imposing figure, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke. "The good father speaks truly. Thomas owes no taxes because he has no money left to pay them. None of us do." One by one, other merchants began stepping forward. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tightly as she joined the growing group around Thomas. "My grandson fights in the king's army while I can barely afford bread for my table," she said, her voice wavering but determined. "How can this be called prosperity?" The guards behind Captain Blackwood exchanged nervous glances. They had signed up to maintain order and protect the kingdom, not to strong-arm struggling families out of their last coins. Several of them began to question whether they were on the right side of this confrontation. A young voice suddenly cut through the tension. "My papa says the king has so much gold he uses it to shoe his horses while we eat stale bread." The words came from little Sarah, the candlemaker's daughter, who had squeezed through the crowd to see what was happening. Her innocent observation struck the assembled people like lightning, and several of them began to nod in agreement. Captain Blackwood realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. What should have been a simple tax collection was turning into something that looked dangerously like the beginning of an uprising. The crowd's mood was shifting from fear to anger, and he could feel their collective will strengthening. "Thomas," called out a familiar voice from the edge of the crowd. Margaret, his pregnant wife, pushed through the gathered people with their 4-year-old daughter Emma clinging to her skirts. Her face was pale with worry, but her eyes blazed with fierce pride as she looked at her husband. "I stand with you," she said simply, taking her place beside him, despite her condition. The sight of the pregnant woman and her small child, standing defiantly before armed guards, sent a murmur through the crowd. It was a powerful image that spoke to something deep in the hearts of everyone watching. Here was a family choosing principle over safety, dignity over survival. Captain Blackwood found himself facing a dilemma that his military training had not prepared him for. He could arrest Thomas, but doing so would likely provoke a riot that could spread throughout the kingdom. He could withdraw and report the incident to the king, but that would be seen as a humiliating defeat for the royal authority he represented. "You're all making a grave mistake," he warned, his voice carrying less conviction than before. "The king will not tolerate this defiance. He has armies at his disposal and resources beyond your imagination." Thomas stepped forward slightly, placing himself more clearly between the guards and his wife and daughter. "Captain, with respect, we are not defying the king out of malice or rebellion. We are simply trying to survive. A king who demands taxes from people who have no food on their tables is a king who has forgotten his duty to protect and serve his people." The baker's words struck home with devastating accuracy. Several of the guards shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own families struggling under the weight of the same taxes they were now trying to collect. The moral foundation of their mission was cracking beneath them. An elderly man named Garrett, who had served as a soldier in the previous king's army, stepped forward with surprising dignity. His back was straight despite his age, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had faced death in battle. "I fought for this kingdom for 20 years, boy," he said, addressing Captain Blackwood with the casual disrespect that only a veteran could get away with. "I shed blood to protect these people and this land. Never once did I imagine that the crown I served would one day turn its sword against the very people I died to protect." The captain's face flushed again, but this time with shame rather than anger. Being called boy by the old soldier stung, but the truth in his words stung even more. Blackwood had joined the Royal Guard with dreams of honor and service, but lately his duties had felt more like the work of a common thief. The crowd continued to grow as news of the confrontation spread through the adjacent streets. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores, farmers left their carts, and even some of the town's more prosperous citizens began to gather. Among them was Councilman Reynolds, a portly man who served as one of the king's local administrators and had the authority to speak for the crown in minor matters. Reynolds pushed through the crowd with obvious discomfort, his fine clothes and soft hands marking him clearly as someone who rarely dealt directly with the common people. When he reached the center of the confrontation, he took in the scene with growing alarm. This was exactly the kind of incident that could end careers and destabilize regions. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" Reynolds demanded, trying to project an authority he clearly did not feel in the face of so many determined faces. Captain Blackwood seized on the councilman's arrival as a potential escape from his predicament. "Sir, this baker refuses to pay the prosperity tax and has incited the crowd to rebellion." But before Reynolds could respond, Thomas spoke up with calm dignity. "Councilman, I have not incited anyone to anything. I have simply stated that I cannot pay taxes I do not have the money for. If standing by that truth makes me a rebel, then I suppose I am one." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Reynolds realized that he was facing something far more dangerous than a simple tax dispute. This was the voice of a people pushed beyond their breaking point, and any response he made would have consequences that reached far beyond this marketplace. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the confrontation showed no signs of resolution. The Royal Guard stood facing a crowd of their own countrymen, while the representatives of the crown struggled to find a way forward that would not ignite a fire that could consume the entire kingdom. Councilman Reynolds surveyed the tense scene before him, his political instincts warring with his sense of duty to the crown. The crowd had swollen to nearly 100 people, and their mood was becoming increasingly defiant. He could see farmers still holding their tools, merchants with flour-dusted aprons, and children clinging to their parents' hands. These were not revolutionaries or criminals, but ordinary citizens pushed to their breaking point. "Thomas Whitmore," Reynolds said carefully, "surely we can find a reasonable solution to this matter. Perhaps a payment plan could be arranged, or a reduction in the amount owed." But Thomas shook his head slowly. "Councilman, you miss the point entirely. This is not about my ability to pay this particular tax. This is about a system that demands more from people who have nothing left to give. You cannot arrange payment plans for money that does not exist." Master Henrik stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of someone who spoke for his entire profession. "The blacksmiths of this region held a meeting last week. Half of us are considering closing our shops because we cannot afford both the taxes and the materials needed to work. If we close, who will make the tools the farmers need? Who will shoe the horses that carry your messages and supplies?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd as other tradespeople began to voice similar concerns. The baker, the candlemaker, the weaver, the carpenter, all told similar stories of businesses on the verge of collapse under the weight of royal taxation. Mrs. Henderson's frail voice cut through the deeper tones of the men. "My daughter in the capital writes that even there, people are struggling. The king's own servants are being dismissed because the royal household cannot afford to pay them all. Yet still the taxes increase." This piece of information sent a shock through both the crowd and the royal officials. If even the capital was struggling, then the kingdom's financial problems ran much deeper than anyone in the provinces had realized. Captain Blackwood found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His sword remained partially drawn, but he was beginning to understand that arresting Thomas would solve nothing and might indeed make everything worse. The baker had become a symbol, and symbols could not be destroyed with steel. Suddenly, a commotion at the edge of the crowd announced the arrival of someone unexpected. Sir Edmund Ravenshallow, the king's own cousin and a member of the royal council, rode into the marketplace on a magnificent black stallion. His arrival sent a wave of whispers through the assembled people, as few had ever seen such a high-ranking nobleman in their humble town. Sir Edmund was known throughout the kingdom as an honest man who had often spoken against his cousin's more excessive policies. His presence here was either coincidental or the result of very fast communication indeed. He dismounted gracefully and surveyed the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Captain Blackwood," Sir Edmund said in a voice that carried absolute authority, "why is your sword drawn in a marketplace full of families and children?" The captain hastily sheathed his weapon, saluting stiffly. "Sir Edmund, this man refuses to pay the prosperity tax, and has stirred the crowd to rebellion." Sir Edmund studied Thomas for a long moment, then looked around at the faces of the assembled people. What he saw there was not rebellion or anger, but desperation and dignity. These were people who had been pushed beyond endurance, but were still trying to maintain their honor and principles. "Tell me, Baker," Sir Edmund said, addressing Thomas directly, "what exactly is your objection to paying this tax?" Thomas met the nobleman's gaze steadily. "My lord, I object not to paying taxes in general, but to paying taxes that I cannot afford. My family already sacrifices daily necessities to meet our obligations to the crown. This new tax would leave us unable to buy food or fuel for the winter. And you?" Sir Edmund turned to address the crowd at large. "Do you all share this man's situation?" A chorus of voices rose in response, each person sharing their own version of the same story. The nobleman listened carefully, and those watching could see his expression growing more troubled with each testimony. Father Benedict stepped forward once again. "My lord, I have been hearing confessions and counseling families in this community for over 30 years. I have never seen such widespread hardship among good, honest, hard-working people. They are not lazy or dishonest. They are simply being asked to give more than they possess." Sir Edmund nodded slowly, then turned to Councilman Reynolds. "What reports have you been sending to the capital about conditions in this region?" Reynolds stammered uncomfortably. I, that is, I have reported that tax collection has been proceeding normally, my lord. Normally? Sir Edmund's voice carried a dangerous edge. Is this scene normal to you? Does a crowd of desperate people confronting armed guards represent normal conditions? The councilman's face went pale as he realized that his career might be ending before his eyes. He had been reporting what he thought his superiors wanted to hear, rather than the truth of the situation. Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement. He had expected arrest, imprisonment, or worse. Instead, his act of defiance seemed to have triggered something much larger than he had imagined possible. Sir Edmund turned back to the baker with an expression of genuine respect. Thomas Whitmore, you have done something today that few men have the courage to do. You have spoken truth to power. And you have done so not for personal gain, but from necessity and principle. He then addressed the entire crowd. People of Aldermere, I want you to know that your voices have been heard today. The prosperity tax is hereby suspended in this region pending a full review of economic conditions. Furthermore, I will be conducting a complete investigation into the tax burden being placed on the common people of this kingdom. A stunned silence fell over the marketplace as people struggled to process what they had just heard. Then, slowly, a cheer began to build among the crowd. It started with little Sarah, the candlemaker's daughter, clapping her hands with joy. Soon, the entire marketplace erupted in celebration. But Sir Edmund raised his hand for silence. Do not mistake this for a complete victory. The kingdom faces real financial challenges, and solutions must be found. But those solutions will not be built on the backs of people who have nothing left to give. He turned to Captain Blackwood. Captain, you and your men will return to the capital with me. You will report directly to the king that the prosperity tax cannot be collected because the people literally do not have the money to pay it. You will also report that attempting to enforce collection would likely result in widespread civil unrest. Captain Blackwood saluted again, but this time his posture suggested relief, rather than military stiffness. Yes, my lord. As the day wore on and the crowd gradually dispersed, Thomas found himself surrounded by neighbors and friends who wanted to shake his hand or pat his back. The baker who had started the morning worried about feeding his family ended it as a local hero who had spoken for an entire community. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Captain Blackwood approached Thomas privately before departing with Sir Edmund. Baker, the captain said quietly, I owe you an apology. I have been so focused on following orders that I forgot to ask whether those orders were just. You reminded me today that a man's duty to his conscience must sometimes outweigh his duty to authority. Thomas shook the captain's offered hand. No apology needed, Captain. We were both doing what we thought was right. The difference is that you have the courage to admit when you might have been wrong. As the royal party departed, and normal life began to resume in the marketplace, Thomas returned to his bread cart. The loaves had gone cold during the confrontation, but somehow they seemed to taste better than any he had baked before. His stand against the royal guard had not just saved his own family from impossible taxation, but had given voice to an entire community's struggle. Margaret hugged her husband tightly as little Emma played at their feet. I was so frightened, she whispered. But I was also so proud. Our children will grow up in a world where ordinary people can stand up for what is right. Thomas smiled as he watched his neighbors going about their daily business with renewed hope in their faces. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were fought not with swords and armies, but with simple words spoken at the right moment by someone willing to accept the consequences of telling the truth. The sun set that evening on a community that had learned something valuable about the power of standing together and the importance of speaking up when silence would be easier. And in the capital, a king would soon learn that true prosperity could never be built on the suffering of his own people.